Hill this morning, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell signaling more interest rates hikes are coming this year, and they could come at a faster pace and hit a higher peak. It's part of the central bank's efforts to tackle inflation and cool the U.S. economy without tipping it into recession. And the cost could be felt in higher unemployment, which the Fed chair was pressed on by Senator Elizabeth Warren today.
Right now, the unemployment rate is 3.4%, which is the lowest in 54 years. And we actually don't think that we need to see a sharp or enormous increase in unemployment to get inflation under control.
I'm looking at your projections. Do you call laying off 2 million people this year not a sharp increase in unemployment?
I would say 4.5%.
Explain that to the 2 million families who are going to be out of work. We need a Fed that will fight for families. And if you're not going to lead that charge, we need someone at the Fed who will.
Joining me now is CNBC senior markets correspondent Dominic Chu. Fed chairs are used to that kind of attacks on the Hill, but that's what combating inflation is all about, isn't it?
It is. And Fed Chair Jerome Powell, Andrea, to your point, basically is trying to reiterate what he and other Fed policymakers have been saying for weeks now, that this fight against inflation is far from over, and it's going to take a lot more effort on the Fed's part to take active measures to slow things down, to slow inflation down overall. Now, the point here is the job situation is going to be tough, but he did say that while inflation has been moderating, the progress and the process of getting inflation back towards that 2% Fed target has a long way to go, and that the road to that inflation target will, in his words, be bumpy. Those are his words. He then cited that recent economic data. It's basically indicated that there's a stronger economy than forecast, and that means more inflationary pressures, and that they remain stubbornly high. That suggests that the ultimate level of interest rates is likely to be higher than previously thought. And Andrea Powell said that if that data continues to come in showing faster growth and stronger inflation, that the Fed stands ready to increase by even more and at a higher pace. So on the job side of things, I will say this. In response to Elizabeth Warren and the exact words that she put out there, the hypothetical loss of 2 million jobs, Powell did push back against Warren by saying that the Fed is only doing what it needs to bring down inflation, no more, and that he also added that this is a balancing act for the greater good, suggesting that, Andrea, if inflation were to remain consistently higher, that it would ultimately hurt working families even worse across the totality of America, Andrea.
But it's such a hard balance. They're surprised by how persistent, how sticky inflation has been, aren't they? I mean, it's taken a lot more action than they initially thought. And sure, I guess is that because of the COVID, the money that was pumped into the economy is lasting longer, that effect?
So, Andrea, to that point, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. The Fed's job is arguably harder, way harder than at any time during its history. It's partly because of what you said, but it's also because it's dealing with an economy and policies that are literally unprecedented in central banking history. A large part of this is just trying to unwind, normalize, if you will, the control of money supply in our country. This is after a decade plus of keeping interest rates at or near zero, which effectively pumped trillions of dollars of almost, so to speak, free cash into the financial system. And then, of course, to your point, the pandemic added economic shutdowns, massive taxpayer-funded fiscal stimulus, and then supply chains that were sent off into fits of chaos because of pandemic policies and repercussions. And again, to Powell's point, this is also the lowest amount of unemployment in roughly half a century. So all of these different moving parts are making this a very, very tough thing to navigate for Fed Chair Jerome Powell, Andrea.
The possibility of a soft landing at this point?
I mean, a recession will eventually happen, Andrea. You and I both know it. We've seen it through history. Economies, by their very nature, are cyclical. They move up and down. The question, I guess, is now when and how deep the downturn will be. If you rewind 6 months ago, a lot of folks were saying that they were predicting a recession. It hasn't happened yet. Doesn't mean it won't. But at this point, the consensus is more towards a mild recession if it does happen, Andrea.